Hi guys, welcome back to episode 11. Here we have Jared Rubin, the professor of economics with a plethora of research at Chapman University. Jared, you want to tell a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm an economic historian, meaning I study the past to try to understand how. I mean, my main interests are why certain parts of the world have become wealthy and others have not. I'm particularly interested in the role that religion and religious institutions have played in that process, mainly in say Europe and the Middle East. And yeah, as you noted, I've been doing this a while. I've been a professor at Chapman University, which is in Southern California, for 12 years, and been a professor for 16. And yeah, I mean that's the general thrust of my research, and looking forward to chatting with you guys.
Yeah, super excited. Oz, you
Sounds
want
like a very, oh yeah, of course, I would love to start, but yeah, it sounds like a very interesting background. So for our first question, so with regards to economics and morality, does economics influence morality, or are they separate notions? And then like an example would be the antebellum South that slavery was a positive good, but it was also an economic boon. So what's the relation between morality and economics, if there's any?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're asking is more about the economy rather than the study of economics. And I think if we're talking about the economy as a whole, it certainly influences morality. And I think the example you gave is a good one in that, I think more generally, rather than say morality, we might want to start by thinking about culture, which morality is kind of a part of culture. And these two things are highly intertwined. So economic development, or where it happens and the way it happens, again, I think the example you gave is a good one. Um, can influence the way that people perceive the world. That's when we think about culture, we're thinking about the way that people take the world around them and map it in their brains. And it's a shared thing. That's why we have a shared culture. And sure, I mean, the economy is very much an important part of shaping culture, and then culture itself then shapes economic development as well. So places where, for instance, there's been a lot of research suggesting that places that have high trust in others, where I just typically tend to trust people, even people I don't know, are much more economically successful than places that don't. And that goes both ways. Places where that are economically successful also tend to have people that are more trusting. Now, when we get to morality, morality is obviously a subjective thing. In different points in time, what we consider moral is changing. What we all think, if we're living a moral life today, people in 50 to 100 years will probably think of us as highly immoral for, whatever, maybe eating meat or going to zoos or things like that. Whereas the example you brought up of slavery, obviously, something that hopefully everyone considers highly immoral today, and many people at the time did as well, but many people didn't. Um, and where there are economic pressures to influence morality, you're more likely to see things that, again, might be of questionable morality, especially from hindsight, being justified. So I think on that front, yeah, I mean, in the example you give is almost a perfect one for thinking about the way that the way that those two features interact. I mean, we could also think about, more modern examples might be something like inequality. What is moral in terms of, how should we treat the poorest in society? There's well, at least two ways of viewing this, and I think both have some justification to them, in that, when we think about what capitalist societies have done over time, is they, in the last 2 centuries, have seen an increase in inequality for sure, but also the lot of the poorest has also become much better. The poorest people, for the most part in the United States, are much better off than even the top, say, 10% were 300 years ago. So this is something where, when we think about what morality is, what it means, it's always subjective and it's always time dependent. But yeah, to your point, part of that subjectivity comes from the economic situation on the ground.
So you kind of like need that communication, the trust, and also like the influence between the both.
Yeah, yeah, they impact each other. I think
because they're all
economics. Yeah, go on.
oh sorry because they're all part of culture essentially. Like they're just
Yeah,
different aspects of culture. That's why they influence.
no, it's more that so economics impacts culture and culture impacts economics, I think, and morality is
Mhm.
kind of one of those aspects of culture because it's something that's society specific. What we consider moral even within the United States, right? I mean, if you go to different parts of the United States, what is considered moral is going to be very different. I live in California. Are both of you located in Florida? I assume.
Yeah.
Ah,
Even between California and Florida, there are differences in what is considered moral. You go to this central part of the country, it's different. You go to the Northeast, it's going to be different. Then think about the U.S. versus other countries. It's all context dependent. Again, economics has something to do with that for sure.
Yeah. And I guess it like kind of answers, but like to kind of reiterate the question in a different tone, does the health of the economy influence religion or culture, or does religion and culture
Yeah,
influence the economy? And I guess like what we had said, it was like
yeah.
a combination of the two. They both give and take from both sides. Um, do you think one influences the other more so, or is more nuanced than the other?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps. So I think this also depends on the time in history you're talking about. So, for instance, one of the most famous theses in the social sciences is Max Weber's Protestant Ethic in the Spirit of Capitalism, and which, to be clear, has since kind of been um, taken apart in many ways, but it led to this, more or less 100 years of research. His thesis was that there's something about Protestantism, particularly the Calvinist brand of Protestantism, that encouraged people to work hard. They wanted to show that they were part of the elect,
Protestant ethic.
and they and in doing so, one way to do that was to have earthly success. So to the extent that we do see those types of as you say, morals or doctrine, really, they might be able to influence the economy for sure. Um, on the other hand, there's also plenty of evidence that economic development, or so the kind of the converse of this is what is known as the secularization hypothesis, which was a very popular hypothesis in the 19th century and is actually being revived now. Namely, that the idea was, and this actually goes all the way back to the Enlightenment, is that as countries grew wealthier, you should expect to see less religiosity. This was something that it's similar to what Marx's famous opiate of the masses type argument, where as people need the as their kind of more worldly demands are taken more care of, they need religion less. And this was something that, in fact, you saw in Europe happening in the course of the 19th and especially the 20th century. It was a bit delayed in the US, which for, I think, historical reasons has always been a little more religious than Europe. But even now in the 21st century, religion on almost all fronts is on decline. So that would be an example, and probably the most important example of the economy affecting religion and religious adherence. Yeah, but as we're saying here, though, it's very much a two-way street. And in the last 15 to 20 years, there's been a boom in research done, at the academic level in the field called the economics of religion, which looks at both of these things. So it looks at both the effects of economic development on religion and religious participation, religious belief. So, do you believe in God? Do you believe in heaven and hell? Things like that. And the converse as well. And particularly historically, what role has, and this is the work, the type of work I do, what role has religion and religious institutions, like the Catholic Church, things like that, played on long run economic development?
Really interesting. Yeah. Do you think like because of the growing secularization of like the modern world and more people traveling to kind of practices that don't involve religion or don't have religion weight their choices as much, do you think that's going to affect the economy in a specific type of way?
Um, Possibly. The the most likely channels will actually probably be political more than anything else. So in places like Europe, for instance, where you've had a lot of secularization, but you're also now getting, say, a lot of Muslim immigration. These are things that are already causing a bit of a culture clash and are leading to politics, some of which has become quite right wing. That in the type of really conservative types of at least domestic politics that has an economic impact as well. And so when we say, to be clear, when we say the that religion is declining, that's mainly a what you might call rich world thing. In other parts of the world, so in the Middle East, there's actually some decline in Islam, but say in sub-Saharan Africa, religious adherence is rising rapidly. In Latin America, actually, Protestant churches are becoming much more popular. So this is something that is also varied across the world. Southeast Asia, similar thing. Even in China, which was by demand secular for
Yeah,
much
yeah,
of the
by the
communist
state
period,
government.
the Christianity is on the rise. So where you have a good fraction of the people now are adhering to Christianity. Same in South Korea. So it's something where yeah, it's varied in its economic impact, or in terms of the decline of religion. And I think it's much more specific to that question. I think it's much more that the arrow goes from economic development to religion rather than the other way around when we're thinking about, say, uh, 21st century Europe or the US.
So like to say that the world is becoming more secular isn't necessarily true. It's more nuanced because when you say
Yeah,
the world, it's really only considering
The
like
developed
Western.
world.
yeah,
Yeah,
the rich world for the most part. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So it's not
And
like total.
even then, a place like South Korea, which is quite rich, is actually becoming uh, more religious as well. So
Is there
even
like a
there, it's
reason like given that like
um,
in a wealth in a country doesn't necessarily define whether religion is more intensively practiced or not, do you think there are other factors that influence such?
oh, for sure, for sure. No, I would. I mean, I don't think any economist of religion would suggest that economics is the only thing. There is a pretty high correlation, to be clear, and it's probably causal on with economic development and religious
Religious.
adherence, and it's a negative correlation, of course. Um, but yeah, no, certainly there are other factors. I mean, the most important ones are always going to be historical. I mean, and this, for instance, explains why the U.S. was about 50 to 100 years behind Europe in terms of becoming more secular. The U.S., at least its European roots were founded on religious dissidents, and this has played a very has had a profound impact on U.S. culture that really I think is probably the main reason why the U.S. looked a little different than Europe throughout much of the 20th century. Europe was becoming much more secularized. The U.S. was not, and now the U.S. is kind of catching up on that front. So and the same would be true of East Asia and other parts of the world that are now rich but not really becoming less religious.
S- So I actually have a small question. So with consumerism, which I guess would come from a capitalistic economy, could that I guess philosophical philosophical emptiness, I guess, that comes with putting too much emphasis on the material, like materialism, could that be causing like a rise in religion? Because once you enter this world and it's really all physical, you might feel this sense of I want something more spiritual. Could that be a reason or
Like a
Possibly, even though
romanticism
I
is
mean, I
formed.
think if anything, it's changing a cause or causing a change in religion itself. So uh, Protestant United States, for instance, in the last 50 years, there's been a rise in what is known as the prosperity gospel, which is kind of really you might say is antithetical to what the words of Jesus in the Bible, but it's really that being rich, showing that you're economically successful, is something that is aligned with the of being a good Christian. It's allowing
So like a
Christianity to
revised
spread.
Protestant work ethic.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is. So it's certainly kind of in the same vein for sure. And that's something that I think a lot of people, maybe to your question, maybe I mean, I obviously don't know individual cases, but maybe people that were feeling somewhat empty from things have really latched onto, because it also helps justify their own prosperity. And yeah, so I mean, yeah, possibly. But again, we don't really see in places that have high consumer cultures, or just wealthy in general. We don't really see a rise in religion in these places. So I think on an individual level, it's certainly true what you say. Some people have probably, almost certainly, seen some type of emptiness in kind of the modern world, or consumer culture, things like that, and turn to religion. But as a on the society level, we're not really seeing that.
Uh-huh. It's interesting to think of.
Yeah.
And moving on
Um,
to yeah, to
yeah, I
move
guess
on.
moving on to our next
Yeah.
question. So,
Yeah.
given that economics is typically a an objective field, have you met resistance with applying religion? How's your research in religion and economics shaped your spiritual outlook, if it has at all?
Yeah, well, okay. So I can answer both those questions. They're a little separate. So the first question is yes. I mean, I've met a little resistance for sure, because so as you say, economics is what we call a positive science as opposed to a normative science. We're trying to explain the way the world is. We're not trying to explain the way we think the world should be. That is where all my research lies. I'm not somebody who's trying to justify religion or come against religion. I'm trying to understand the role that religion has played in economic development. Religion is one of the most kind of idiosyncratic. It's the not idiosyncratic. It's more pervasive, I should say, most pervasive cultural things we have in our history. As people, that it's obvious it must have played some role in economic development one way or the other, right? So as positive social scientists, as people that want to understand the way the world is, it is a question that is worth asking, even if it might upset some people, right? So yes, I mean, so my a lot of my research has been on the Islamic world, and what I have argued, and again, it's not just just making an argument without backing it up. I have plenty of support for the arguments. Is that it's not so much Islam itself that caused the reversal of fortunes between the Middle East and Western Europe, which there was. So after the spread of Islam, the Middle East was far ahead of Europe for centuries, economically,
Yeah, like in the 8th,
scientifically.
ninth century, the advent of
Yeah,
algebra and so
yeah,
much else.
for
Yeah,
sure.
the
Medicine.
golden age of Islam. Yeah.
Yeah, for about 400 years, there's a golden age of Islam after it spread in the 7th century. There's a clear reversal of fortunes, though. Industrialization doesn't happen in the Middle East. The Middle East falls far behind Western Europe, and there was a long tradition of social scientists that would look at, or that essentially blamed Islam, said there's something about Islam, and that kind of never really sat well with me, mainly because it has a hard time explaining why Islam was so far ahead for so long. Um, but then looking into it, reading, doing economic research on it, the argument I was able to put forth was that it's not so much Islam itself, but it's the role that Islam has played in politics that has played a role in its relative underdevelopment. And this is something that switched over time. Eventually, Christianity, while it was obviously also really important in the medieval church in medieval politics, it
It was separated from
eventually
the government.
it eventually became, yeah. So eventually you get parliaments rising, and it's the economic elites have more power, and you start getting policies that are more in their favor. And that really doesn't have anything to do necessarily, it has, little to do with the content of Islam, but not really. It's not really, the content of the religions that matters as much here. But that was something that, I definitely got pushback from, because, some people don't want to believe that some people don't even really want to believe that there's any reversal of fortunes, which I think is on the face of it ridiculous. But Others
Yeah,
certainly don't want to believe that religion in any way, shape, or form might have contributed to the economic divergence. And I
because
think,
it's something
when
held to such a high standard at those places.
well, it's also something that people really, strongly believe in, and they don't want to believe that there could be anything negative associated with religion. And that this is obviously isn't just true of Islam. There's plenty of negative to do with every religion. I think there's plenty of positive to do with any religion as well. Um, but this is a question though that we can't ignore just because it might make some people, including possibly ourselves, feel uncomfortable. And when you ask me about my spiritual, whether it affected me spiritually, I'll just tell you, so from I've always been interested in religion, but I myself am not religious. Or I'd consider myself atheist, or most agnostic, but probably atheist. But I've always been fascinated by religion, and in fact because I'm atheist, because I don't understand it. I don't understand the appeal, but I also understand that it clearly has an appeal. I mean, it's been you said it's one of the things that I think makes us human is that we have these types of beliefs. Whether you go back to even pre-organized religions, and then religion, we have a capacity to believe in the supernatural. We have a capacity to believe things that are unprovable, and they really help shape our lives and the way we think. And it would be ridiculous to say that religion does not affect the way most people in human history have perceived the world. And so that has been something that I've always wanted to know more about. So I took a ton of religion classes in my undergrad. And then when I went to grad school, I didn't think I would be able to study it, but then it just so happened that one of the professors there who became my advisor had done some work in religion, and kind of showed me the ropes there. And I've been studying it ever since. It hasn't affected the way I personally believe, because this is something that I'm able to separate. It's my own belief from the way from analyzing the way that humans act and interact. That's what economics is, at least what microeconomics is. And this is something that yeah, I mean, I think we should always be willing to change our beliefs when there's new evidence that's put forth. But the type of evidence that I try to accumulate in my own research has nothing to do with, say, proving the existence of God, or say, or showing whether religious faith is something that, or affecting the way I perceive the world. But I do think it's really important to understand how it affects the types of actions, especially
Objective.
the economic actions of people and societies.
I think, yeah, and we can totally relate to like that feeling of like the lack of feeling of religion drives the curiosity in it because you know its impacts, but you can't necessarily feel them. So you study it in like an objective field to kind of want to gauge the impacts on something you can measure because you can't feel it. At least that's like what we've taken from it. Um,
Yep, I
and
think that's a good way of putting it. And
I
I
think
mean,
it's
I
also
had a similar path.
and also like building off, it's not only that, but it's also an individual drive. I mean, if this thing is such a huge part of our, society culture, as Stephen, you have said, then I mean it only makes sense to at least try to understand this primal driving force. Like what we've always had religion. We've had animism as hunter-gatherers, and then polytheism, monotheism, and now even, you can argue secularism is a new form of religion. So I think it's important just to study that for the sake of
Hmm.
it's just a part of humanity.
Yeah, absolutely. That's
and like
that's
it's
where I
kind of
came down
interesting,
on
like
for
even
sure.
though you study like these relationships between like the economy and religion and kind of like how it lies within like even though like the research is objective and I understand that, have there been any times where you just like find something out or like you're just doing like, I don't know, a literature review or just historical review based on some regions and you think to yourself like, wow, and then like kind of like relate that to your own spiritual understanding, or are you really disconnected from that?
Um, I've certainly had many things where I've, read something that I didn't know before and was completely unexpected and thought, wow, that's fascinating. I will say, I mean, it's never really affected my own what I would say is my own spiritual journey. I mean, again, because most of the type of stuff that I'm interested in reading is it's really historical and understanding the paths that these societies have taken, both religious paths, but also the economic paths. At the end, I am an economist, and that's the type of research I'm interested in doing. So no, I mean, I'd say that, and it's not that, and I would say it's not that I'm dogmatic in my own stance. I'm not. I certainly would consider myself an atheist, but I'm also not. I'm open to understanding. Again, why people believe, and if I'd like to think that if something I were to come across something that was fundamental to the way I would view things, I might be able to change my viewpoint on that, but I have not, and I probably won't. Would be my guess, because I think that, and specifically the type of research I'm interested in is much more, kind of trying to link these kind of long run religious trends with long run economic trends. A lot of that's not really going to be the type of stuff that affects one's spirituality, but again, it's I think that it's important to keep our minds open to these types of things, and I've certainly changed my opinions on the linkages between religion and economics, and vice versa, based on my own and really the research of others as well. That has been, when something's convincing, you should always try to change your priors.
Yeah. I mean, the open mind is like kind of probably the thing that's most important in research. Once you have a closed mind about something, you can't perform well research, a good
Yeah.
research on it because you suffer from so many biases, and also just keeping an open mind allows you to research like just well, like it's just like the fundamental pillar of
Yeah.
It's the
um
scientific method. I mean, you have to start with a question. You have to be willing to accept the results.
Yep. Yep.
yeah.
That's right.
And like just on your gateway to like an open mind, like what would you say lacks in economic research in general?
You mean in the field of economics? What are we lacking?
Yeah, like yeah, what should we focus on in the future?
Well, there's a lot. Maybe I'll focus on the type of stuff that I'm interested in. This is a podcast, to some degree, related to religion, so we can talk about that. So we've come to know a lot more in the last decade on the role that this is really something that this research has blossomed in the last, like, say, 10, 15 years, on the role that religion has played historically in developing economies, and in the 20th and 21st centuries as well. What we know a lot less about from the economic, or at least not just economics and social sciences, is say the role that non-Abrahamic faiths have played. So outside of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, we it's something that's clear. Hinduism, for instance, is a religion subscribed to by over 1 billion people. Yet we know very little, except for some studies on the caste system, its role in economic development. We know very little about the role that Buddhism has played in the economic development of East Asia, or lack thereof. This is something where religion, I think all religions, just like almost all cultural features, typically have both positive and negative economic consequences. But it's really about spelling out what those are. I would say for younger people that might be interested in going into economics, I think there's a lot to be done in introducing people to the fact that these are not two distinct concepts. That at the undergraduate level, and certainly then at the graduate level, that these are the types of questions that are really central to the study of economics, I think. Even though they're not currently in in the academic field of economics, the economics of religion is still a relatively small field, even though it's really growing. That and because of that, because it's something that it was quote unquote founded in the early 90s. One of my colleagues at Chapman University, Larry Onaconee, is one of the founders, really started applying economic insights to religion. and he was more or less almost the only one doing it for about 10 to 15 years, but something that since the early 2000s, so about 20 years now, people have really started to pick up as something that's central. But that also means that there's a lot of questions that are unanswered, even among the Abrahamic faiths.
Because of how
um,
new the research field is.
yeah, exactly. I mean, and there's just so many questions, because religion is so pervasive in all societies, that even among the faiths that have been studied a lot, like particularly
There's so
Christian,
much.
Jewish, and Islamic societies, there's still a lot of questions that we just don't know the answer to. That I think there'll be that we'll know a lot more. If we were to do this podcast again in 10 years, that the answer to this question might be a little different, because I think we're seeing so much research come out in this field right now.
Yeah, that's a really cool point. And also, like, I think related, not necessarily to like economics and religion, but social economics has also like blown up recently. And that's like honestly, like, I hadn't talked to this with Dr. Goldstone as we had said, but like the research I'm conducting now is social economic research, which isn't necessarily linked with religion, but kind of just like social behaviors and how the economy affects that and how they affect like
Yeah,
their own kind of set of like behaviors, social behaviors creating like an objective pattern, which is kind of like what this is doing.
yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I think that what you're kind of describing is similar to what we call cultural economics. So looking at the role that cultures play, or kind of these agreed upon, or not even implicitly agreed upon norms that societies have and how they affect economic development. This is something that is also, it's obviously related to religion. I would consider religion to kind of be a subset of culture in a way. But more broadly, cultural economics has really taken off, and that's been a little bit more so in the last 25-ish years, as something that economists are increasingly seeing the role that culture. You cannot understand a lot of economic phenomena without understanding the differences in cultures across societies and the impact that they have on decision making.
Yeah, yeah, it's like more realistic economics, I feel, because like today, during this year, my junior year, like I've taken like AP macro and microeconomics, and like sure, like the concepts and the pillars are very interesting, but a lot of those concepts don't hold up under the irregularities of our world. I mean, like there are people who base their religions off of non-objective factors. They don't work in the best ways that should work for them in terms of like utils or objective matters, and rather like there are these things that we need to gauge, but we don't like or are increasingly doing, like religion and how those influence factors and how that leads to decisions that otherwise are not necessarily covered by the fundamental courses of economics.
Well, because I mean,
Yeah,
we're not. Oh, sorry. Uh,
go
because I
ahead.
mean, we're not robots. We have human nature, which is influenced by culture, and that's why it's never an exact science when it comes to anything social. And I guess
It's
the more
true.
we understand those social phenomena, the more we can, I guess, attempt to make it into an exact science. I don't think we'll ever be able to, but at least we can get closer.
Yeah, and it's not an exact science, and I don't think it was ever meant to be. I don't think social sciences are. That's the I think the interesting thing about social science relative to the hard sciences really is that it is something that people are unique, and people are there's no laws really, and there is a law of demand, say, but it's really something that even that can be broken, right? Demand
Higher
curves
law of
can
wages.
slope
Yeah.
upward under weird circumstances. But no, I mean, I think that yeah, I mean, I think this is right, and and this is, but this doesn't also mean that we should throw out the economic way of thinking, because we can think about culture as we can use our economic models as as baselines and think, all right, well, why do they work differently in different societies, and that's where we can then ascribe culture as maybe affecting tastes, which would be something you would certainly go over in principles of microclass, or
Yeah,
thinking
it's a
why these cultures
fundamentals of drug
evolve over
demand.
time. I mean, yeah, so it's something that we do have to have a conception of what culture is and how it evolves. And economists do have thoughts on this. There's a very famous set of models that look at how culture evolves over time from an economic perspective and what that might mean. So yeah, I mean, I think that again, we're kind of we're re-understanding. This was something that, if you look at the early 20th century, many people studying economics would have thought that culture played a big role in the disparities in economic development across the world. But the reason that it became
Like the
something
Lorenz
that,
curve.
no, not even that. It's more that, it was more actually people like Weber who were, I would say were very Eurocentric in the way that, or yeah, at best, and probably racist at worst, and saying it was just something about European culture that was better for economic development. And and there might have been aspects, I mean, of things that happened in Europe that might have led to economic development. But economists, I think, rightfully shied away from those types of theories throughout the course of the 20th century. But the pendulum kind of swung too far, to the point where, and
Just
this
treated
might have
it.
been what you studied in your micro classes, where we just are, maximizing over some utility function,
Yeah.
and everything can be explained by that. Where, no, I mean, we have culture, we have this way of perceiving the world that is, not, it's not even necessarily individual. Culture works at a society level, but it's also does clearly impact the way that we think. So these two things are not mutually exclusive. We can still use the basic models of economics. We just have to do it carefully.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Like it's not. I'm not necessarily saying that they don't obey the laws of economics. It's more like when you look at like the shifters of demand and you think of taste, you more think of like the typical like, oh, this is becoming more popular because of a magazine cover that advertised such and such. But if it's more just
Yeah.
a religious taste that also has an influence, and that's kind of like what are you saying? Like we need to study more of,
Yeah.
and like its its emphasis on the
Possibly. Yeah. I
fundamentals of.
mean, yeah, I mean, that can be the type of thing that is certainly studied, and we certainly would need to know more to get at kind of the underlying kind of cultural values that lead to, if you want to talk about, say, demand for goods or things like that. Sure, I mean that's something that we need to know much more about, I think.
Yeah.
So I guess going back to human history, human culture, do you believe that having a large, organized, unifying system, whether that is religion or anything else, is necessary to have a healthy economy? Or is that not necessary at all?
Yeah, there has to be something. I mean, so there's been very few societies, if any, in world history that haven't had something, uh, tying it together. More so, if anything else, it's hard to have a state and a state ideology without um,
Like Soviet.
some
For
way
sure.
of, say, gaining state legitimacy, something like that, which is all kind of either, kind of ideological or something like that. It can be religion. It doesn't have to be religion. It can be secular ideology, works just fine for many of these things. But and it doesn't obviously have to be shared by everyone. In the U.S. today, we're more, I think, polarized than just about any other time in our history, and a lot, and not most of the polarization, though clearly some of it's religious, a lot of it's not, and that doesn't actually, the polarization probably doesn't, almost certainly does not contribute to economic growth. But it's there's been no society that has really grown in human history without some type of ideology. Again, and actually most of it's not really religious. If we look at what almost all of the growth that has happened in world economic history has happened in the last 200 years. Most, there have been societies in the past that have grown, but they've kind of reverted. We talked about, say the Islamic Golden Age, something like that. But that went back. The Roman Empire. There was what you know. I know you've had Jack Goldstone on. He calls growth efflorescences, that happened, but then there was a reversion.
Yeah.
There's been no
Yeah.
reversion in the last few hundred years, and there's no real reason to believe there would be a major reversion unless there's a massive climate or nuclear warfare or something like that. Um, and and yeah, all of those societies have had something. Ideology is something that I think is just part of a society in a sense. You're going to have something holding societies together. And say in the U.S., it would have been, at least to some degree, beliefs in, say, democratic norms that hold the government together, or something along these lines. There are ideologies that do contribute to economic development, but again, since most of the growth has happened in a setting in the last few hundred years where, if anything, religion's been on decline. I don't really think, where we can really pinpoint religion as a driving factor. Even though, again, my own research would suggest that, if anything, it was kind of the shift away from government interference, or not interference, but government, or rather religious authorities playing
religious
a role,
involvement
a
within the
major role
government
in government, that was has
hindering
been kind of
growth.
key to the growth of many societies. Getting rid of that, yeah.
So I
Yeah.
guess like a follow-up question or even a different question is, so we have the state already established. How polarized or divided can we be before the economy underlying that state decides to collapse? Because we mentioned America, right? We're becoming more and more polarized thanks to, I guess, in part technology. It's easy to access information, but like at what point can we? Yeah, just at like what point does polarization become too much and then economy fragments?
Well, this is a key question that, there's been a lot of political economy work done on this. And this is something where, it's it to the extent that polarization affects economic development, it's mainly through politics. The politics would be the channel, and yeah, it's conflict, right? So conflict is the thing that you're really worried about. Internal conflict as being something that can really just not just stifle economic growth, but cause a major growth reversal, where you get, at worst case, something like civil wars. But there's more kind of subtle, not even necessarily violent conflict that can happen, that really, subjugate certain groups or people with certain beliefs when one group gets an upper hand, and this happens in polarized societies more often. So yeah, the answer is going to differ by society, but there's certainly, as I think you're getting at here, a degree of polarization. Once you get beyond that point, it's going to be bad for economic development again. And then the real causal pathway there is via politics and what politics can reign.
It's like essentially like a disequilibrium between like the fact of the level of polarization and its role in politics. And if you enter that, it can kind of lead to market or country failure.
You can, yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah, I was going to ask the next question.
Yeah, yeah, sure. Um, so this is when we wrote this question. This was actually it was inspired by there was an economist from the Middle Ages. The name escapes me, but he effectively said in a society you can either have a strong economy with a strong army and all of these things, but have a decadent people, or you could have wise, virtuous people, but have a weak economy in turn. So, what are your thoughts on that? Do we need is it better to have a society that's has a strong economy but has a decadent lifestyle, a weak cultural background, or the vice versa? Helps it.
I don't. Yeah. So, if you're talking about anybody living prior to 200 years ago, prior to when the economies took off, that is probably how it looks. So, I'm not. I'm not. The quotes you're saying are kind of reminiscent of, Ibn Khaldun, a Middle Eastern philosopher of the Middle Ages, who kind of looked at the cycles that societies went through. Namely, you'd have these societies where they were poor farmers, but they were revolting against somebody, and then they would win. And the first rulers of these societies would be really dedicated to, because they grew up poor, or they grew up under being suppressed conditions, and they would be really dedicated to the people and things like this. And then their children would then take over at some point, and their children would have lived more of a life of luxury, even though they would have had their parents around. And this would be kind of, in a sense, the high watermark for these societies, because you now have a society that's old enough to grow, maybe foster trade, things like this. But then you get their kids, the grandkids of the original people, maybe a couple of generations later ruling, and they've only they've only had a life of luxury. They're not hard, and they're easy to overtake essentially because they lose their guard, they things like that. um that was not actually a terrible way of describing most of the world prior to about 200 years ago, but we no longer, I would say, we no longer think of those things as mutually exclusive. You can have most of a society that lives in good amount of wealth. I mean, look at say the United States or most parts of Europe. They're most of us are not hardened by any means. We're not warriors. We're not tilling the ground. And there's no reason that this has led to anything but more economic development. A lot of this has to do with technology, and the technologies being available to allow this to happen, to allow for most people to not have to work in agriculture, for instance, which was the lot of most people in world history, especially prior to a couple hundred years ago, and frankly even prior to the last century. Um, so this is something that has changed, and I don't think that any longer remains true. I mean, and even with military technology these days, it frankly doesn't even matter how big your military is in terms of people. I mean, most of it's technology, right? I mean, even a place like North Korea can be a major threat. Once they gain nuclear weapons. The United States, we have obviously a gigantic military, both in terms of people and budget, but you could cut the amount of people working in the military by quite a bit, and we'd still be a very potent military. So these are things that the technology has allowed, I think, that equilibrium to shift quite a bit.
Yeah.
So it's not so much like a hard man creates strong times create weak men, weak create. Okay, and it's more so a technological thing.
I think so. Yeah. But on the other hand, there are things that there are other there's some research say recently that's been done, which I find very convincing, that those who lived during the Depression had very different cultural values than those who grew up after the Depression. Especially with respect to things economists think are important, like saving. People, that even after they became wealthy, if they lived through the
Which was
Depression
so
and
true.
remember the hunger and the bread lines and things like that, were much less likely to spend extravagantly. They're much
And the
more
savings
modest
would
in the way.
essentially promote investment spending, which would shift both like the supply and demand to the right in the long run.
Well, yeah, I mean,
According to my macro.
but maybe it probably goes the other way because they're consuming less, for the most
Mm.
part. So but it's more, that type of research is more about thinking about the role that kind of early experiences and kind of that affect cultural values can play later in life as well. And to the degree to which that is what you're describing as, I think that's the 20th century equivalent of being a hard man or a hard woman, right? Is living in poverty even in a wealthy society that does affect the way we think about things. But I think it's a bit different than what was being described certainly in the medieval period.
Okay, yeah, that's great. I know you said you had to leave at one. Do you want to try one more question or wrap it up now?
Sure, we can do one more question.
Okay. So we notice your cross-cultural and religious analysis of economic systems. So like in your books, you say culture on one hand, and then for the other, it's religion. And do you think there's a difference between culture and religion from an economic standpoint? I know previously in our
Yeah.
episode you had said religion is like a subsect
Mhm.
of culture. And what do you think makes it a subsect and the differences between the two and how that plays in economy?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's two things of importance here to this question. One is that, so the way we think about culture, the way, is the way cultural anthropologists think about culture. It's kind of an internal mapping that you have in your brain from seeing things in the world, and the world's very complex. So culture kind of gives you these shortcuts in how to interpret the world. And by nature, it's social. It's something that you see other people doing in your society. You probably gain a lot of it from your parents. Early in life, you gain it from peers. You might gain it from teachers, things like that, that really kind of shape the way that you think. And I think that religions are very, there's certain aspects of religions that are very similar, that they give you a way of interpreting the world around you. Now, a big difference between what we would call religion and more broadly culture, is that religion, especially say of the Abrahamic faiths, but even outside as well, some many Eastern religions have this as well, is that there are institutions associated with religion. So you think of big churches, or just synagogues or mosques, things like this, where you have hierarchies of individuals who are religious authorities, that it's much more organized in a way than most aspects of culture are. Culture is something that's it's very disorganized in a way. It's something that's not even conscious, that gets transmitted from one generation to another.
Kind of
I
like how
certainly,
American culture developed, and like it wasn't necessarily something spoken of, it was an unspoken development across like a multitude of causes.
yeah, and even when we say American culture, there's many subcultures within the U.S.
Melting
and
pot,
the
yeah.
way, yeah, the way that the United States, or sorry, not the way that social scientists think about culture too. It's something that's really transmitted. It's transmitted within the family, at least initially. I certainly, my kids have certain cultural beliefs that they share with me, but not fully, because they've been since influenced by going out in the world, things like that. So, and that's where you get this really kind of the social aspect of culture that as you call it maybe an American culture. So I'm in Southern California. There's certainly a culture here that's quite a bit different than other parts of the United States. And religion, we can certainly think to some degree that is because if you want the best predictor of what religion um, somebody is, you just say, well, what's the religion of their parents? This is something that it's not that we have this menu of religious options and we have a blank slate and we can just choose. We're influenced heavily early in life when it comes to religion. So we certainly, there's a lot of similarities between the two. But again, I think the biggest difference is this kind of institutional aspect of religion. And the reason that's so important, stuff we've kind of been talking about here, is that the institutions allow religion to play a much stronger role in politics, say, and that can really have big economic consequences, and it has historically, with religious authorities either playing a big role in directly in politics or influencing politics indirectly. That is because of the institutional organizations that religion has. There's a much more direct pathway to that happening than what we might think of as as culture. Even though culture clearly influences economic and political decision making as well. It's just a little bit more direct with religion. Obviously, there's other differences. In religion,
No,
really,
yeah.
it deals with the supernatural and things like this. But
Yeah,
when
yeah.
we're talking about the economic impacts of it, I think that that's the big one. Is the more the organizational aspects of it.
Because like religion is more organized, it's easier to track a direct impact.
Yeah, and it's also just easier for it to have a direct impact because the organization helps solve all the types of collective action problems and coordination problems
Yeah.
that really kind of decentralized or dispersed kind of cultural, maybe what we'd call cultural entrepreneurs have a hard time doing.
And while like cultural is definitely has its impacts, it's more like understood rather than like a cohesive belief. So that's why it's like less hard to, I mean, it's harder to like gauge as a cause or gauge as a
Perhaps,
coordination organization.
perhaps. I mean, sometimes it's easy to gauge. You might think of, say like anti-immigrant sentiment can be kind of a cultural thing,
Yeah.
right? That you can gauge that, So, but also, it's also the type of thing that is there are organizations that have emerged on that front, but on the other hand, there's it's nothing like you don't have like a Catholic Church of of those types of cultural beliefs, right? That
Yeah.
kind of package those together. And in fact, a lot of cultural beliefs, there's several cultural beliefs in the United States that are not religious at all. But if you want the best predictor of having those cultural beliefs, or what religious denomination the person is.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of those are on the religious, on the political spectrum too. If you want if you want the best predictor of whether somebody voted for Donald Trump, for instance, the best thing you need to know is whether they're evangelical Christian or not.
Wow. Yeah. That's interesting. Is that why like maybe in like Soviet Union, Russia, like during that time, they say that even though there was like no mandated religion, a lot of people say like the religion became the state and the state doctrine because that was a culture preached so heavily and so specifically that that kind of consolidated into a direct religion.
But then
Yeah, I
even
mean, yeah.
Oh, sorry. But
Yeah, no,
then
it's
even in the Soviet Union, they took it a step above. It wasn't so much that the state was forcing itself to be a religion to the people, not so much that the people were choosing that to be their religion. Like the state, uh, they looked at what other religions would do. They created their own holidays focused around the revolution, and they enforced it onto the people rather than the people enforcing it onto themselves. So I don't know if that's
yeah, yeah. No, I mean there's certainly aspects of communist state ideology that have a lot of what you might call the characteristics that social scientists have seen in religion apply there as well, for sure. I mean, I think when we think of ideology, religious ideology is one type of ideology, but there's a lot of similarities across religious and non-religious ideology, and you can analytically you can study it the same way.
Uh-uh. That's really fascinating. All right, yeah. So does anyone else have any other questions before we wrap this up?
no. I thought this was
No?
incredibly interesting, being
Yeah.
able to
All
hear
right.
the economic perspective.
Yeah. Especially like as like I aspire to be like an economics major, kind of just like knowing that I mean, what I my so far experience, though, like my research is social economics, like my academic experience is more like very objective. Well, religion isn't really accounted for, like cultural or
Hmm.
sometimes geographical impacts are accounted for, but usually it's just more like centered around, for macro, it's America, and then for micro, it's very individual. Um,
Hmm.
so I think this was a really quick perspective to have. Thank you guys so much for watching. Do you have any other, Jared, do you have anything to say? Or
I don't. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
yeah, thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Drop any questions you have. Yeah, thanks, guys. Bye.
Thank you. We'll see you on the next episode.